Good evening, this is News Select. It's July 12, 2050. The headlines. The main news today: scientists are predicting a year of disasters on an unprecedented scale. The reason? Global warming. Predicted effects range from floods to landslides. Droughts are forecast too. The death rate from starvation worldwide is set to rise to 20,000 a week. In the next 12 months, meteorologists are predicting a death toll well into the tens of millions from weather disasters alone.
This film tells the story of a terrible year in our future. A year when the world's biggest killer is our climate. Global warming may take millions of lives. Scientists are predicting storms more savage than anything we've yet seen. Fire and flood. Destruction on a massive scale. In our future, global warming could cause up to 30 million deaths in a single year. That year is 2050. We live on an astonishing planet, a vast world. Mountains, oceans, immense plains. It is a world of wonders. Home to over 6 billion human beings. Our home. And we're destroying it. Scientists first began worrying in the 1980s. Freak hot summers year after year.
You can see large warming in North America.
They suspected it was the greenhouse effect.
It's continuing a trend that we're seeing toward increased temperatures.
But was it? Research began worldwide.
The increasing greenhouse gases. This all is consistent with an increasing number of extreme events.
By the mid-90s, the scientists were completely sure. Even world leaders were convinced.
Global climate change affecting how we and all others on this planet will live to avoid leaving our children and our grandchildren with a catastrophe.
By 1996, we knew we were changing the world's climate. We are choking our own planet. Carbon dioxide from our cars and factories, from burning and deforestation, is trapping more and more of the sun's heat. As we pollute our planet, it's becoming hotter. Already, the Earth is half a degree warmer than it was 100 years ago. What will it be like in 50 years' time? Already, our climate is changing. The recent floods in Europe have been more widespread and severe than ever. Around the world, events which were rare or distant are happening more frequently. This is what just a half-degree temperature rise can do. 50 years from now, our planet will be 5 degrees warmer. Global warming will transform our world forever.
Well, there's no question that global warming is real and that the cause of global warming is ourselves. It's the polluting activities of mankind. That is without question. On the one hand, you may have a few maverick scientists, a few groups who have their own agenda, who have their own vested interests at trying to pretend that global warming is not happening, or at the very least that it's a natural variation in the climate. But that's completely untrue. 1,000 of the world's top climate scientists have contributed to the United Nations report that says global warming is real, it's big news, it's serious, and it's the biggest threat we've ever faced.
Bill Maguire heads Europe's largest hazard research centre. He and the vast majority of scientists now believe global warming will have consequences we can barely imagine today.
Nobody is safe and nowhere is safe. There's nowhere to hide and there's not going to be anywhere we can run. In the year 2000, 1 in 30 people were affected by natural hazards worldwide. By the time we get to 2050, or maybe a little bit later on, I think that figure will be 1 in 1. In other words, everyone is going to be affected by natural hazards every year.
Good evening. The Week in Review. It's August the 15th, 2050. Just over a month ago, we reported predictions that the next 12 months would see a sharp rise in climate-related disasters. This week, the catastrophes that are already making those predictions come true. The flash floods in Italy this morning have already claimed 782 lives. The floods bring the total of weather-related disasters to 57 within the last 4 weeks. Casualties overall for the last month now stand in excess of 80,000. Fires are still ripping through California. 20,000 people have been evacuated and 200 are now feared dead. In Australia, bushfires have claimed 87 lives in the Sydney suburbs.
There are places today where we can glimpse what tomorrow may hold. Doug Kopp is today's foremost rescue engineer.
Process bacteria. And then we say here, 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 here. But no more disinfectant.
His job is to take apart the wreckage left by a disaster and search for bodies, or if he's lucky, for survivors.
11.
He has witnessed the horrors all of us may face in the future. In a sense, global warming is already a reality for him.
If someone was to ask me, Doug, we want to film a disaster, or we want to see a disaster, or we want something to do with a disaster, where do we go? And I would say, well, look, your best bet is to go to Peru, because they are beaten down continuously every few months with one disaster or another.
Peru is plagued by El Niño, a weather event that hits once every few years, when a current in the Pacific Ocean suddenly changes direction. Whenever it strikes, it causes certain, irresistible and global disaster. The world is racked by floods, fires, storms and droughts. El Niño hints at the horrific future that may await us all, not every few years, but all the time.
Escuchamos un ruido demasiado fuerte.
We heard a loud noise, and from the direction of Simbal, we saw an avalanche.
Hemos visto que un alud,
Sludge, mud, rocks. It dragged along animals, trees,
árboles,
and ripped away all the houses.
Before we rebuilt, all this was in ruins. It was a disaster. Houses, gardens, everything.
Todo esto acá son zanjas que han hecho.
All of this was in ruins. The El Niño flattened everything.
This is what global warming may one day do to us all. These ruins near Trujillo in the north of the country were left by a flood during the last El Niño. This, now a wasteland of rubble, was home to hundreds. In this single village just 3 years ago, more than 90 people died.
In the village that we visited, with the huge area of total and complete destruction, with even foundations gone, nothing left except a ring of debris that floated in from the river, and the traces of roads running through it. That was completely devastated, completely destroyed. Surrounding it are homes and half rubble. Next El Nino in 3 months' time, they will be completely destroyed.
These images were filmed during an El Nino event in 1998 and 99. More than 20 natural disasters hit the country in less than a year. Flash floods and mudslides killed 2,000. Just as global warming brings the certainty that disasters will strike us all, so here they know that the next El Nino is never far away. Now, 3 years later, it's another El Nino year.
I think El Nino is an excellent example of what we might expect to face in the future as global warming really gets going. And when an El Nino develops, it has a knock-on effect across the whole planet, from sort of blizzards in Peru to floods in Central Europe to drought in Africa, drought in Australia. It has a global impact. And in that sense, El Nino can be regarded as a small example of what we can all expect.
Except global warming will be far worse. Its effects will vary widely, but science can already tell us what our future holds. The seas will warm. At the poles, the ice will begin to melt. Sea levels around the world will rise. In warmer countries, the cycle of dryness and rain will become ever more extreme. As more and more heat pumps into our atmosphere, crippling droughts will be followed by devastating floods. Entire cities will find themselves underwater. Everywhere, storms will become more savage and more intense. Nowhere will be safe. Even life in paradise is under threat. In the Bahamas, they have already experienced what warmer sea temperatures can do. Here, just like Peru, the last El Nino caused destruction. But here it was not lives, it was coral. Coral reefs are among the richest ecosystems on our planet. Environments so diverse and complex that so far we've only learned a fraction of what there is to discover. And before we can learn, many of the world's reefs may have vanished. If the oceans warm, the coral will die, and we have almost no idea what the consequences might be.
This reef here used to be a healthy reef up until about 1998, when there was an El Nino event, which caused sea surface temperatures to rise only about a degree or two, but that was enough to cause the corals to expel the symbiotic algae that live inside of them, which gives them a lot of their food. And after doing that, it was so severe that these corals died, and now they're about 90% dead corals here, where there used to be about 90% live corals.
Sea temperatures here rose just 1.5 degrees for just 2 weeks. It killed almost all the coral. All that remains are these dead structures, devoid of color, almost completely devoid of life.
A lot of the corals were affected. They were bleached white. Many of them recovered. Other ones are still in the process of recovering. So we're just starting to see the regrowth process occur here. In some places, the corals aren't able to get a foothold yet because there's algae and other things that have taken over where there used to be coral. So it's likely to take decades, if not longer, to recover.
But if the coral needs decades to recover, then its future is bleak, not just in the Bahamas, but everywhere. Global warming is predicted to make sea temperatures permanently warmer. That will kill the coral permanently. And if the reefs vanish, countries will lose more than just a natural wonder. They will lose their main defense against the sea.
The reefs are an important barrier for the land, protection against the open ocean, basically. In places where you have a barrier reef, different parts of the Bahamas, throughout the Caribbean and Australia, the Great Barrier Reef is extremely important as a breakwater.
If countries like the Bahamas lose their coral, the only defenses they will have left will be man-made. And man-made defenses may not be enough. This seawall protects Nassau Harbour, or tries to. These blocks are immense, 15 tons each, yet a single storm ripped away a section almost half a kilometre long.
That storm sat almost 1,000 miles away from the Bahamas, but radiated strong waves that caused extensive damage in the Bahamas. The wave energy was sufficiently severe that it actually took out almost a quarter-mile section of the major sea defenses that protected Nassau Harbor.
Philip Weech is head of the Bahamas National Climate Change Committee. For him, global warming is a real and immediate threat.
Crystal balling is always very difficult in trying to predict what the future is like. It's almost like you and I as a child trying to see what the future is going to be. We would not have imagined, for instance, computers. We would not have imagined many things, but some of those early indicators in the climate systems are there already. What we now know is that what climate change does, it adds more energy to the atmosphere. And the more energy is then translated into events like increased rainfall or more intense storms or more variable weather or more variable climate. We're taking climate change seriously simply because we suffer from too many things. We're vulnerable to too many things that affect our livelihoods and threaten our very way of life. We don't live in isolation. What happens in the United Kingdom or what happens in Europe or the United States affect what happens in the Bahamas. And so we need to make sure we protect all of ourselves because we all live in the same world.
No more tropical paradise. Warmer seas will kill the reefs and expose millions to the full force of the sea. And at the same time, a new threat will emerge. Because the warmer the sea, the fiercer the hurricane.
Early this morning, Hurricane Mabel finally hit land. It swept across Puerto Rico, killing an estimated 12,000. The storm is now heading north towards America, making it the 10th hurricane to hit the US so far this year. The probability of it hitting Washington is now 93% and rising. Meteorologists expect damage costing hundreds of billions of dollars in America alone. The storm is currently heading for Haiti. It will almost certainly cause thousands of deaths. Washington is in trouble too. 10 million people have already been evacuated, but an estimated 3 million have refused to leave. Rioting and looting there as the civil defense forces struggle to take control of the city. Mabel has already hit Category 5, the top of the hurricane scale, and it's still getting stronger. Experts predict.
Hurricanes are fed by the heat of the ocean. Now obviously the warmer the ocean, and the oceans will warm up as the planet warms up, the more hurricanes and the stronger hurricanes you're likely to spawn. And the devastation will be just extraordinary. A large percentage of the buildings severely damaged or knocked down. These are enormously powerful phenomena with the strengths of hundreds of nuclear bombs.
Hurricanes are the largest, most powerful storms on Earth. They can whip the sea up into a 10-meter surge. Waves reach impossible heights. A hurricane's power is irresistible. Survive one, and it's an experience you'll never forget.
The dock that I'm sitting on right here was just carried away by waves and washed up on shore a couple hundred meters.
It brought seawater in at about almost a quarter of a mile further inland than it was before.
We did have one boat out on a mooring here that's up on the shore now.
It damaged buildings, it destroyed property.
Part of the road that we have washed away just because the waves were coming in from this direction and breaking right on the road.
Seawater was pushed inland, some 6 or 7 miles inland, and essentially drained into the ocean on the opposite side.
The thought of having more frequent hurricanes or more intense hurricanes is a really scary one, especially for me, because my wife and I just bought a piece of property on Great Exuma that's about as close to the water as where I'm sitting now, and if a big storm comes through, the house is gone and we lose everything, so it's pretty scary, yeah.
By 2050, hurricanes could be more frequent and more powerful, bringing winds, storm surges, and floods. How will we cope? How many will die? The worst we've experienced today will seem trivial tomorrow. Our future is a dangerous place. In the future, it's possible that nowhere will be safe. Franco Mantovani lives in the Po Valley in Italy. 16 million live here, a third of the country's population. All of them are at risk. The danger is flooding, and the threat is from the River Po.
This is the Po River. Actually, the level is very low because we are in a dry season, but you have to think that during the rain season, the level can reach this, where we are now. On the opposite side of the Po River, you see the small village of Poleselle. As you can see, the topography is very different. The level of the Po River is higher, something like 5-10 meters of the village. And that is a very high risk, especially when we have a lot of precipitation.
50 years from now, the Po will regularly overflow its banks onto the helpless towns and villages 10 meters below. The problem is the sea. Sea levels around the world have risen 2.5 millimeters in the last 50 years. By 2050, they will be up to 50 centimeters higher. Any river, the Po included, flows down to the sea. So if sea levels go up, the river has nowhere to go. It has to flood. Worse still, the Po Delta is not just below river level, it's below sea level too. Here in the fishing port of Goro, you can only see the top floors of the surrounding houses. In Italy, even if the river doesn't overflow onto the land, the sea will. It's tempting for us all to think that there are places where we'll be safe. Look at our cities, environments totally controlled by human beings and their machines. Surely our technology can protect us. But many cities are already under attack. This is the Thames Barrier, London's last defence against the sea. When they are not in use, these curved walls rotate down into channels in the riverbed. The Thames is a tidal river. The North Sea may be 100 kilometres away, but at high tide, the river regularly fills almost to the limits of London's embankments. And when the seas are too high, driven by exceptional winds or tides, the barriers must rotate into place. They form a wall over 20 meters high, taller than a 5-story building. It blocks the sea from driving upstream and prevents the river from backing up and flooding. But the Thames Barrier is already being overwhelmed. Within 20 years, rising sea levels and more severe storms will mean the barrier has to be replaced. It will cost over £4 billion. But the alternative would be to abandon Britain's capital to the waves.
Floods across much of Southeast Asia today. The Yellow River has all but vanished over the last 18 years, but today, what's left of it burst its banks. An estimated 15 million are homeless, and Gaiju city is already underwater. More rain is forecast, and several other cities are already under threat. On top of the floods themselves, disease, toxic waste spills and malnutrition are expected to be the major problems. Forecasts put the death toll at the floods at 800,000 minimum, and experts are warning that the situation could get worse.
It's easy to imagine that this vision of our future is nothing but fantasy. Could something as inconvenient as the weather really do so much harm? Look around the world we live in today. Recently, there have been massive floods in Europe. You can't blame any single flood on global warming, but when freak weather stretches across most of a continent, you can begin to detect the first hints of climate change. Global warming offers the terrifying prospect that this kind of damage may become not a freak, but a normal part of every year.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. We've seen temperatures rise by 0.6 of a degree Celsius in the last 100 years. It's predicted, at worst, to increase by another 6 degrees by the end of this century. Now, that's incredible. If we're already starting to see these more extreme events happening now, with that tiny rise, what the heck are we going to see in 100 years' time?
Coastal cities everywhere will be in danger. But it's not just cities. Research suggests that in the future, nowhere will be safe. In the mountains, global warming will pose a very different danger, but one that is just as deadly. These are the Italian Dolomites, famous for their scenery and tranquility. It's another kind of paradise, but even here, things are not always as they appear. As the scars on this mountainside reveal.
That's in a landslide, a huge landslide, 7 million of cubic meters of material, marsh and clay with a high content of water that create a very high speed of movement. The movement that we can measure is between 30 and 40 meters per day. The risk for the villages is very high because the landslide is continuously moving.
This particular landslide was filmed in China, but the same thing can happen on mountains all across the world, and often does. In the Dolomites, when it rains heavily, the land turns into soft, slippery mud. Whole mountainsides of earth lose their grip on the rock underneath them and slide. All this mud was once part of the hillside above it. It flowed down the valley like a river, stopping just short of the village of Funès. The mud here is over 100 meters deep, and the threat returns every time it rains.
Maybe it will fall down, and this could be a very high risk for the population. We hope no.
Well, mountains are what are known as sensitive terrains. The slightest change in climate or in weather, and they can be very severely affected. Now, what we can expect in the future as mountainous terrain starts to warm up and permafrost starts to melt is that you will start to see the formation of gigantic landslides.
The signs of danger are everywhere. Just a kilometer down from the Tessina landslide, the town of Lamosano has problems of its own. The town has been here for hundreds of years, but we now know that beneath it lies a fault in the rock. In recent times, the whole village has begun cracking apart. The road surface now has to be entirely remade every year. And a few years ago, the arches in these two walls were perfectly aligned. In Lamosano, the threat is not a mudslide from above. It's that the fault beneath them will give way. Global warming will bring more rain. Water will seep into the fault, lubricating the rock, encouraging it to slide. If the fault does give way, Lamosano will be turned to rubble in seconds. For anyone caught here, death would be certain.
The people here, they know that maybe a landslide can occur and can destroy the houses, but they stay here. They doesn't want to leave the area. They want to stay here.
Even if the people here did choose to abandon the mountains, they might find that there was nowhere else to go. In the mountains, science predicts landslides. In the valleys, floods. What will happen to us when disasters are striking all the time and everywhere? To us, it may seem a remote prospect. To some, it's already a reality.
Actually, we need to get them higher ground.
We need to get them some tents or some temporary shelter. We also need to get some food and supplies for them, and some means to cook and things, because their place was destroyed last time, and we don't want that to happen to them again. Disasters are becoming more complex. If you have an earthquake in the middle of a bad El Nino, then you have avalanches in the high country. You have rock slides, mudslides, landslides, collapsed buildings, floods, flash floods, all the water-related diseases, contamination problems. You have one disaster or two disasters which cause a chain reaction where, depending on where you are, you can be affected by 5 or 6 different disasters. From my perspective, and I've worked at more than 100 major disasters in the world, things are just continuing to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
What Peru suffers during an El Nino year is what Doug Kopp believes we will all suffer in the future. A life where just coping with disaster consumes everything. In his vision of the future, anything beyond basic survival would be a luxury beyond price.
These El Ninos are becoming more and more severe and more frequent as our climate is changing and our planet is convulsing from being so set upon. You have landslides and mudslides, and people are killed from that. And massive destruction continues and continues and continues. They're beaten down into the dirt, and then they come out and they try to overcome their psychological problems and their absolute depression. And then they try to start over, and they half get going, and then they're beaten down in the dirt again. How many times can you be beaten down and put in such a miserable state before it affects you mentally that you just start not caring? You stop caring, and you don't paint your house anymore. What's the sense in painting your house? Because it's only going to be destroyed. What's the sense in putting half a wall back up again? Because it's only going to be destroyed. And not only do you have to have the work involved in the repair, but you also have to have the money and spend the money that you could spend on food or something else to repair your house. It's only going to be destroyed again.
This is the future which scientists predict awaits us all. And beyond the immediate horror of human suffering lies another shocking question. Who is going to pay?
Money markets in crisis. Chaotic scenes tonight as the euro goes into freefall. We ask, what is the price of stability? Good evening. The year of the disaster continues tonight. The latest casualty? The financial system. Over the last 8 months, more than 10 million people have died through weather catastrophes, disasters ranging from flash floods to famines to landslides. Now, a single typhoon has triggered the complete collapse of the money markets. The storm hit Tokyo last night, causing damage estimated at 700 trillion yen. Asian money markets underwrite almost 60% of world trade. When European markets opened for business, they crashed.
Scientists predict that just the cost of protecting ourselves from the climate will be immense. The cost of rebuilding will be incalculable. And when money is tight, the markets sell. How can any country afford to rebuild all this? Not once, but over and over again. The cost of protection and reconstruction could plunge even the most affluent nations into poverty. Climate change doesn't threaten us just with death, but financial destruction.
We're beginning to reach a situation in some parts of the world where being hit by a storm or being hit by a flood are certain. fragile economies in particular are going to start to collapse. So that's going to have an impact on world trade. World trade is certainly going to suffer as a result of that. And as a result, you will have a knock-on effect from one economy to another economy. Things are just going to start to degrade and deteriorate, I think, over the next 50 to 100 years.
Our way of life will be under attack. Disaster after disaster will strain the world's financial systems to the limit. With homes in ruins, food and water hard to come by, world trade in tatters, the environmental catastrophe could turn into something else entirely. Human catastrophe. Wars, terrorism, coups and riots, mass migrations of refugees desperate for food, for water, for peace.
There's no question that we're going to see more conflict. By something like 2025, there are going to be 5 billion people living in countries which have inadequate water supplies. People are going to start to move to countries where they can get water, and people in those countries are going to object, and you're going to start seeing conflict and war and economic migration on a scale that we've never experienced for a very long time.
Scientists have already seen our future. They know global warming will hit us hard. They know we need to act now. We could still change the future. Reducing carbon dioxide is technically possible, but someone has to make it happen.
I'm extremely worried about global warming, and I'm extremely depressed as well, because we need something like a 60 to 70% cut in greenhouse gas emissions to stabilize the climate. Kyoto budgeted for a 5% cut, and since then, for example, the United States has increased its emissions by 20%. We're not doing anything at all to avoid the major impacts of global warming. In fact, we're actually pumping out more greenhouse gas. So the situation in the long term looks incredibly depressing.
Industrialists, politicians, scientists may have discovered the problem, but the solution is beyond their power.
I don't think that you can get the world's leaders together in a room and force them to do something about global warming. I don't think that's going to happen until those countries are hit time and time again by the results of global warming. When a hurricane hits Miami bang on and destroys a substantial part of the city, when you get drought across the central US and you have dust bowl conditions again, in other words, until it's proven to them that the world's warming up and that they're going to be severely impacted by that, they're not going to do anything. Well, that's going to be too late.
Our future is already beginning. Look around you. Unexpected floods, fires, freak storms and droughts. Even the seasons are becoming less predictable. Our own experience already tells us that the climate is changing, and science tells us that the consequences will be horrific.
Well, I hope it happens that these people who are causing this problem, who are causing all this pollution, who are killing our planet, because of no reason other than greed. Because all the problems that are causing, this pollution can be worked out, because the means to do it, the technological means exist. It's just that the economics, because they have so much money invested in this destruction pattern, that is the root cause of all of these problems. And I hope that they do something about it before Britain becomes like Peru, or Germany becomes like Peru, or the United States becomes like Peru. okay? Because once all the people are beaten down, once all the resources are destroyed, once all the homes and the infrastructure are destroyed, they aren't going to be making as much money.
What you have been watching is not alarmist. This is what scientists believe will happen. Our own technology is killing us, our own prosperity. Even if we stop immediately, the disasters will come. If we don't stop, things could be even worse. Global warming could actually plunge the world into the most horrific freeze.
Good evening. Over 10 million cubic kilometers of near-freezing water is tonight pouring unchecked into the Atlantic Ocean. It's a disaster of global proportions. The lake draining into the Atlantic is the remains of the 2-kilometer thick Greenland ice sheets. Now it has broken through the thin walls of ice that kept it from the sea. The cold water is pouring directly into the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. Scientists fear the result is now inevitable. The Gulf Stream current will stop. It will plunge Europe into the worst freeze it has experienced for 20,000 years. And that will have global consequences. In the next 10 years, a new ice age will begin.